Hello, welcome to today. Thank you for joining our event today. My name is Katie. I am one of the educators at Body Safety Australia and working on some of our wonderful projects such as today's event. So whether you've come out of curiosity or from a relative professional background, we appreciate you taking the time. Before we get underway, we would like to begin with an acknowledgement of country because it's really important that we recognise the land that we're gathering here today, whether it's in person, online. We are meeting on Wurundjeri land, including all of our meetings that have taken place up until today have been on Wurundjeri country. We acknowledge and pay our respects to the past, present and future elders, and I really love to extend those respects to any First Nations people in the room today. We acknowledge that sovereignty has never been ceded because it has always been and always will be Aboriginal land. Body Safety Australia provides prevention of sexual violence education to children, adolescents, parents, caregivers, and professional development. We celebrate diversity and respect for all and seek to elevate the voices of young people, much like we'll be doing today. So at Body Safety Australia, BSA, we are always looking to provide these conversations in a safe place and respect one another welcomed in this space. So please keep in mind that today is for the students' voices to be heard, but we encourage questions, seeking clarification or curiosity of opinion. And we also encourage agency to seek help for your wellbeing. So please reach out for any support numbers in case today's discussion has been triggering or upsetting. Body Safety Australia's project Respect the Future, which is our panel event today, has been proudly funded by Respect Victoria, Safe and Equal as part of their 16 Days of Activism project, which focused on prevention work in family, domestic and or gendered violence. So our panel conversation will take an intersectional approach where we seek opinions from young people who belong to one or more of the following minority communities. We've got disability, LGBTIQA+ community, culturally and linguistically diverse, migrant and or refugee and faith-based communities. Our primary focus will be platforming the voices of the young people to hear what works in consent and respectful relationships education and how adults can improve their delivery with a special focus on diversity and inclusion. By capturing the views of the important youth cohort, we can understand how we as adults can best support the young people in gaining access to useful and relevant consent education in correlation to adults becoming effective advocates and allies in this sector. So leading up to the panel, the students have gathered weekly to discuss contemporary topics and themes that were both relevant and really important when it comes to learning about consent and respectful relationships. I will now pass the handle over to our lovely facilitator who will be running today's panel, our Body Safety Australia educator, Jay Jones. Over to you, Jay.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Katie. My name is Jay Jones. I am a facilitator here at Body Safety Australia. So I deliver consent workshops with children from ages 3 and young adults up to age 18, also working with communities. So I run parent carer workshops to empower the adults charged with doing this important work, having these consent conversations. I have a background in education and also study children's literature, politics and policy, and gender and sexuality. I'm very eager for you to hear from the voices of these incredible young panelists that I've been in conversation with for the last few weeks. So I will hand it over to them to introduce themselves.
Hi, I'm Shuka. I'm 16 years old. I'm a Year 11 student, and I'm currently head of my school's Pride Club. And so I joined this panel to better my own education on consent and how that works in school environments, but also to hopefully take something away and share with my school community and better my own understanding and better the understanding of educators around me on consent education and how we can make it better for everyone involved to make sure that all voices are represented and heard.
Incredible, amazing. Rowan, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Rowan. I use they, them, and season pronouns. I'm a proud autistic gender lesbian, and I join this panel because I really care about specifically advocacy and diversity. And I also think this is just really important work that we should be thinking about more and doing more. As for my resume, I'm a mentor for my school's neurodiverse mentors association. So I work with younger kids with autism, ADHD, and other neurodivergencies. And I'm also a member of my school's Pride Association.
Amazing, thank you. And Vitaly.
Hi everyone, I'm Natalie. I'm 18 and I'm currently a Year 12 student. I joined this panel because I'm really interested in making meaningful and long-lasting change, and I admire the work that Body Safety Australia does, educating not only students but educators like all of you. So,
amazing. As I'm sure you can already tell, we do have a group of really insightful change makers here today, and I'm very eager for you to hear directly from them around their lived experience and their insights into how we can be better allies, as Katie said, in doing this really important work. At Body Safety Australia, we always adopt a strength-based approach. So we have had a lot of conversations about our experiences with consent education, and we've reflected on those moments that have been really meaningful or positive or inclusive in the classroom. And I've asked our panelists to share a small success story from their experience with consent education. So Shrika, take it away.
So one of the things I find really successful that specifically more so teachers have done for students is after coming back from their PT, so a professional development day, they've come back and shared the information that they've learned and how it's benefited them. And so this was really sort of helpful to me to sort of understand that my teachers were also in the same space I was, and like they're still learning as well. And it really helped create those meaningful relationships with my teachers and helped create like a closer and more like connected bond with them, which, you know, built trust. And I was able to, you know, talk to them about more things, knowing that they're on a similar growing journey as I am.
Amazing. And Rowan, what about you?
I think one of my school's biggest successes, especially in the consent education space, was recognizing that they couldn't always do it alone. And so we've had some really incredible outside workshops from many different organisations, including Body Safety Australia, but some others as well, where we've had really, you know, incredible, passionate, interesting people come to talk to us about this really important stuff. And I think the fact that my school was able to recognise where they couldn't do it or where they could, but they knew someone else could do it better, where they could reach out for help and expertise to make sure that the education we got was as good as it could possibly be.
Great insight, Meta. Thank you. And Natalie, would you like to?
very similar to Rowan's, but outsourcing to experts and people who feel very passionate in this area was one of my school's very big successes, I would say.
Amazing people who know. So we've got a really strong message there around the importance of teachers being trained, getting that professional development and feeling confident in this space to do that work, communicating to their young people, and also bringing in those experts to get that expertise when it's needed. Fantastic. We know as educators and as young people that consent education is crucial for ensuring safe and healthy, positive communities. So this work is really crucial to building on that. But as a lot of our conversations have led into, we've explored how the consent education that we've received might have looked a bit like a yes-no binary approach to consent. And we've spoken about moving away from that approach. Building on the consent conversation from a young age, so maybe from that early learning space all the way up into the secondary space, so that we can scaffold learning around the complexities of consent, taking into account all of the nuances that contribute to a person's ability to say yes or to say no. Things like compliance, things like pressure, and things like coercion. So I am curious to know, Shrika, from your perspective, how do you think this yes-no binary approach to consent education impacts young people and communities?
So oftentimes, as Jane mentioned, when consent is taught, there is a very sort of black and white way in which we we think about it, and so that can oftentimes suppress a lot of minority voices, but also it it also has sorry, it also has the tendency to create blame, shame, and stigma in especially young AFAB people. So specifically in the school environment, young girls. So consent often teaches girls specifically how to avoid being assaulted rather than how to stop assaulting, if that makes sense. Like rather than teaching specifically young men why we shouldn't be breaching people's boundaries. We're often taught that that it is our responsibility to avoid being put in situations like this. So this creates a lot of internal blame and stigma within oneself because you know you feel as though that if you are somehow in a situation where your consent has been violated or you've been assaulted, there is this idea that it is now your fault because you should have gotten away or you should have not put yourself in that situation. And that can be really dangerous because it doesn't allow people to come up and share their stories and seek the help that they need to heal and become better. And also it diminishes like consequences for perpetrators and for aggressors, as they've now, after committing like a violent, dangerous act, a breach of consent, they're now able to get away scot-free, no consequences, because the person they assaulted hasn't felt empowered enough to come out and speak about their story. I think also relating back to that binary way of thinking, now one of the more common ways that consent is violated is online. And most of us have social media, most of us use social media on a daily basis. And so there's this really big sort of just switch off just log out of Instagram, just block the person. There's very sort of, again, coming back to how you can prevent yourself from being assaulted rather than how you can prevent others from assaulting mindset. And firstly, a lot of the times when consent is violated online, it isn't usually, it is, but it isn't always from someone like a complete stranger. Yes, many young people get unsolicited, explicit photos, but a lot of but a lot of the time, it is from someone you know very, very personally, like a friend you've built a connection with over a period of time, someone you see every day at school. So, for safety reasons and also just for someone's own mental health, it can be really difficult to just block the person or just to not respond or not to interact, because oftentimes, especially with young girls, we feel a lot of responsibility to get ourselves out of situations and we don't often get the help we need to, mitigate these situations. And so this very binary way of thinking has a really big negative impact. Also, something else to acknowledge is the fact that many of us have already had experiences with breaches of consent, assault, whatever it may be. And so having a lot of these times in the classroom, these conversations are under the assumption that we haven't yet. And this is something that only happens to, women in their 20s who after a night of drinking are pointed in an alleyway and are assaulted, when a lot of the times this happens, at school in front of so many people, right in front of the teacher's eyes, yet it isn't really acknowledged like that. And I think, one of the main reasons for this is due to the fact that it's really difficult for educators to acknowledge that in the classroom, there are both victims and perpetrators, and both in many cases, because we know that consent and assault isn't always, there isn't always one victim, one perpetrator. And we have this idea of the perfect victim, the perfect perpetrator. And so it's really important for educators to rid themselves of the bias they previously had, where, they assume that these victims are, girls, as I said, girls in their 20s who have been drinking, or, old men with beards and, who are buff and being cornered in an alleyway, because it could very well be someone in your classroom who is a victim or a perpetrator or both. And it is really hard to acknowledge that, and it is really it must be really difficult for educators to have to live with the knowledge that there are people that you teach every day, that you build a relationship with, that have committed acts like this. But oftentimes the easiest thing is to just ignore that fact, but the easiest thing isn't always the right thing to do. And so, yes, it may be hard, but it is important that we focus on how consent is breached within a school environment when we're talking to teenagers, because that is the experience that they're most likely going to have. Additionally, there is a big focus on laws, consent laws. What is the age of consent? You know, what is legal drinking age? What is this? What is that? Which is very important. We don't discount that. Like, it is so important to know what the boundaries are, but we also need to acknowledge that knowing these boundaries help other people push the boundaries. So, while most people learn these things in good faith and know that, okay, well, this is what I can and can't do, it also gives other people ways to work around that, find loopholes so they can commit, acts of violence and breach of consent without consequences, because they know how to move around these boundaries. So I guess sort of to conclude, all this, like, sort of this binary way of thinking has a really negative impact on blame, shame, and stigma. Because it causes a lot of internal blame, and so having everyone have this binary way of thinking causes other people to blame victims as well. And once you've been in a situation where you feel as though your consent has been breached, it's so hard to come out about it. And you feel this deep shame within you, because you feel as though your experience isn't valid enough. Your experience, doesn't matter. Your experience wasn't the experience that everyone else has. And so there is that, big stigma in the consent education realm where, we don't often think about the messy side of consent.
Yeah. Many different ways that consent can look and those breaches can look. Thank you so much for sharing. That was incredibly insightful. We've got these really strong messages around creating a safe classroom where victims in the room can be safely held in that space. But also all of the nuances and all of the complexities of consent are considered. And also the idea that consent looks different online too, and that's maybe a different conversation that needs to be navigated by educators with young people, acknowledging that young people are online. I know, Rowan, you have a lot of insights onto what that looks like. Would you like to share?
Yeah, I think the broad, and obviously this is a generalization, but a lot of teachers will sort of attack things that happen in the online realm as though they could happen in a different universe. So online, sorry, I'm a little sick. It's not COVID. I'm not a plague carrier, I promise. That when things happen in the online realm, they're so divorced from reality that they get treated in a different way. So bullying, while they're there, it's cyberbullying. It's not bullying. And so they get attacked in different parts of a code of behavior. They get different consequences. And there's this really big sort of thing with online stuff, which is, take a photo, don't respond, block them, tell that. And it's not usually that simple. Partly because, first of all, let's talk about how we normalize it. Because it's sort of become assumed that if you're a young femme-presenting person or even a young guy on the internet, that you will get unsolicited penis photographs. And it's sort of like, that's so annoying. But it's the digital equivalent of pulling your pants down in someone's face. And so when people do that, they're sort of treated as seriously as if they've done in real life, because it's just online, because you can just block them, you can delete the picture. I mean, you've already seen it, you can't unsee that. And there's the converse as well, which is the fact that people are... My school had a discussion of nudes and sending online, sexting, nude pictures, stuff like that. in the context of cyberbullying. And what we were told about nudes is just don't do it. Do not send naked pictures ever under any circumstances, because if they get leaked, there's nothing you can do and it will ruin your life. But it ignores the fact that, we have tried abstinence-only education in a lot of consent spaces, and we know it doesn't work.
Mm-hmm.
So the fact that we're applying it to this space suggests that, we're still exploring kind of what consent looks like online, because obviously online and digital spaces are newer. But I don't know if I'm right. What people are going to send nudes. Sometimes it's because they're pressured into doing it. Sometimes it's perfectly normal, consensual thing that happens. And sometimes it goes wrong. And when we have this sort of idea of just don't do it, then what do you do if you have? And, you end up with that picture shared on the internet, shared with people you don't want to share to, used to blackmail you. The idea of just don't do it and this sort of abstinence-based approach puts a lot of shame on people who have, because there are people who have. It's just like any other thing where we get told just don't do it in school. Underage drinking, drugs, alcohol, sex, stuff like that. There are people who are doing it, and if they don't get the resources they need to sort of understand the consequences and how to do it safely, then they can't get help. And we don't treat it the same way in the online realm, even though we should.
Yeah. It is our job as adults and as educators to make sure that we are creating safe spaces for young people who seek help when they need it. When we have this idea of stigma and shame and blame in the classroom, it disempowers that process. So I think that is an incredible insight, and I really appreciate you sharing that, Rowan. Trigger, do you have something more to add?
So Rowan mentioned this already, but obviously I think it's a bit of a generalization, but I think as a whole we've moved past, when talking about sex education specifically, past the abstinence thing, because we know it doesn't work. We know that, yes, it's so much easier to just tell teenagers not to do it, but realistically we know that that isn't going to stop them. And we know it is a much better option to tell them, these are how you can do it safely, or these are the reasons, why it's important to have safe sex. And so, again, these things can be applied in all areas of consent education. And I think a lot of the time there's this idea that telling kids how to do things safely will just encourage them to do it more. So, if we're telling, teenagers, if you are to send nudes, do it so that your face isn't in it, or do it so that, you make sure it's not saved. And I feel like even if it is encouraging people to send nudes, it is a much safer alternative for them to do it safely than for them to do it unsafely. And again, what Rowan said with shame and how, it puts shame on people who have sent nudes and who have, partaken in this. Once their photo is leaked, oftentimes the blame is so briefly put on the person who leaked that picture or that message or whatever it was, it then shifts right back to the person who sent it. And we again try to always have this, binary approach of one victim, one perpetrator, when in reality that's not the case. And so we try to make the person who sent this photo now the perpetrator, because, how are they a victim? It was their choice to send this. How are they now the victim? It wasn't, if they didn't want this leaked, then they shouldn't have sent it. When so then again, the consequences to people who are breaching consent like this, just it's not followed through. And so again, especially with younger AFAB people, it puts the shame back on them. And a lot of the times when it comes to consent education, we're not addressing the root cause. So again, when it comes to, explicit photos, we're not asking why are they sending explicit photos. We're asking why, we're not sort of asking why do they feel like they have to. We're asking why would they send this, And a lot of the information that we feed young teenagers is that, sexual and romantic relationships are so important at this age, when in reality that's not really that true. And so it puts a lot of pressure on people to to share these photos and to do all these things because they feel as though that's the only way that they'll be accepted and that's the only way that, that's what being a teenager is. It's, taking risks, it's, doing all that, when we need to address sort of why are we giving this information? Why are we not addressing the fact that, teenagers feel as though they have to grow up and feel as though they have to engage in sexual behaviors to be a good teenager?
Yeah, no, I love that take. We need to move away from that idea of like just focusing on harm reduction, but also like empowering young people to be able to have safe and healthy relationships and friendships and have those boundaries and put them up and have those boundaries respected. Yeah, Rowan.
I think kind of the kernel, I think, of what Sharika's getting at, correct me if I'm wrong, is that if we, the way we talk about consent education sort of informs what we think consent looks like. And so if we start from a place of talking about boundaries and talking about how those boundaries can and how they should be respected, and if we talk about understanding, pressure and coercion and compliance, maybe some people will understand when they feel pressure to send nudes that it's okay not to. And the people who do it because they want to will also understand that if those nudes get leaked, it's not their fault, they're not bad, and that, there are things they can do. The best thing we can do for victims in this space, and even for perpetrators, because a lot of the time, teenagers don't necessarily understand the nuances of life. And so sometimes a breach of consent is a deliberate violent act, and sometimes it can legitimately be a misunderstanding. If nobody tells the perpetrator what they did was wrong, and if they don't get consequences for those actions, they'll never learn, and they'll grow up and end up doing it again. And so the best thing we can do really for everyone in the space is to acknowledge the realities of consent, because that's the only way anyone can learn what it should look like.
I think that leads us perfectly into my next question. So thank you. But I did want to ask, if we're moving away from this yes/no, black and white binary approach to consent education, what complexities and nuances need to be considered in the consent education world, and how does that look?
So we've talked a lot about the complexities of consent.
Yes, we have.
And it's been an extensive topic of discussion, but that's because it's important. And when we talk about consent, we usually, the assumption is we're talking about sex. And so when people say, oh, we want to have consent education with young kids in kindergartens and stuff, people's knee-jerk reaction is, oh, we shouldn't be teaching little kids about sex, which is understandable because, you probably shouldn't be teaching kids about sex. But if we move away from that, we think about consent as the bigger picture, which is it's about boundaries, and it's about having those boundaries respected and how healthy relationships are formed. And that doesn't just apply to sexual and romantic relationships, it also applies to friendships. It applies to having emotional boundaries pushed. It applies to something as simple as, can I touch your hair, or is it okay if I hug you? And if you look at it from that perspective, that is something we should be teaching kids. We should be teaching kids that, they have the right not to be touched in ways they don't want to be. And we should be teaching kids that they shouldn't be pushing other people's boundaries and doing things to other people that they don't like. And then the problem is that sort of in the classroom, we divorce the idea of boundaries from the idea of consent, because boundaries is healthy communication and then consent is sex. When we talk about consent, we talk about sexual assault. And when we talk about sexual assault, we talk about rape. And we use the word sexual assault as a stand-in for that because rape is a distressing word. It's a big word. It's not really one we like hearing, and understandably so. It's not really one you want to, casually say in the classroom. But the problem is that sexual assault is not just that. So when we talk about sexual assault and we have this idea in our heads of, like Shruti said, the perfect victim and the perfect perpetrator, of, being held up in an alleyway, and that it's, it's physical violence, and it's, that it doesn't look like that. Even in the sort of extreme where we are talking about rape, in the real world, breaches of consent usually happen. Usually the perpetrator is someone you know, it's someone you trust. It can be someone you're in a relationship with, and it's not as simple. But we don't talk about that because it's less of an easy thing to point out and say, this is bad, this is wrong. And it's understandable to want in the classroom to have very clear examples. But the issue with that is that if we only take this one idea of what a breach of consent looks like, we end up glossing over the huge mess of reality of that it's not just this one thing. There's this huge no man's land, essentially, of that sexual assault it can be groping, it can be harassment, it can be these breaches of consent that are real but that aren't treated as seriously because it wasn't that bad, he just touched your chest, stuff like that. And we also end up not talking about the even more messy reality of when there's not a clear line between the person who was the assaulter and the person who was assaulted. Because crossing boundaries, if someone's under the influence, for instance, they can't consent properly because they're not able to give informed consent and their decision making is impaired. But what if you're both under the influence and, you have sex and you don't feel good about it afterwards? But it's much more complicated than just the idea of, one of you was the aggressor and one of you was the attacked, because you're both, in a sense, a victim of each other's decisions and your own. And there's a shame that comes with that. We're not easily able to talk about an experience that is somewhere in that grey area because it is hard to draw lines about what that looks like. So I'm not saying it's easy. By no means am I saying it's easy. I do not envy anyone who has to deal with this in the classroom because it's big, it's complicated, it's a many-headed beast, it's a hydra. So to anyone who's even trying, I mean, kudos to you. But I think the urge with consent is to try and simplify it to make it easier to talk about. But by simplifying it, we do ourselves a disservice. And we ignore and gloss over a bigger, messier reality that it is likely that a lot of people in the classroom will have had experiences with or will have experiences with, and so need to know about. And, when it also comes to the resources we use, they can be dubious. We've talked about the TV video quite a bit. And
I might ask Natalie, do you want to speak to, would you like to speak to the consent video and the resources that are often used and how to oversimplify?
I think that it does make it easier to teach consent if it's simplified, but it doesn't help anyone in the long term.
Mm-hmm.
The T video is, what was it?
Animation, like a graphic
video made in 7 years ago.
7 years ago.
And it basically talks about a cup of tea as
a stand-in
for sex, and your friend coming over and saying, I'd like a cup of tea, and then the person goes away and makes the cup of tea, and then they're like, actually, I don't want the tea. Don't force them to have the tea.
Yeah.
So it basically just reduces sort of sexual assault, sex, consent down to a cup of tea.
As I said, we've talked quite a bit about the T video and others of its kind, which is that these resources, these sort of instructional videos, can be useful. The issue is a lot of them involve really weird metaphors. And there's a lot of problems with that. One is, like we've said, consent is big and complicated and messy, and so reducing it down to something simple like tea does it a disservice. And it fails to appreciate the nuance of the topic, which I think people don't want to necessarily teach because they think kids won't understand it. which, you know, we're not 5-year-olds in secondary school. We're small, slightly more impulsive, slightly less well-read adults.
But clearly capable of having.
We're capable of having difficult conversations, and it's, you know, it's insulting almost that people think we're not, that people treat teenagers like an alien species rather than like, you know,
Young adults.
like young adults, which is what we are. And sure, some people our age are a lot less mature, but
Sorry, thank you for holding with us with the technological drama. I appreciate it. Rowan was just sharing about their experience as an autistic person with these resources. Would you like to summarize?
yeah. It's sort of gone on my whole spiel again. These resources simplify things to a degree that elides the larger reality, which makes it really difficult to talk about, and it's also not accessible to people like me who are literal. And so I understand the metaphors, right? I understand when someone says consent is like tea, they don't mean sexual assault is throwing tea in someone's face. But there are people, you know, who may not get that understanding from a video that doesn't really want to talk about the subject directly. And, you know, it's understandable not wanting to talk about it directly because, again, it's big and it's messy. And so I don't envy people who teach this in the classroom, and I'm impressed that you do it all. But I still think we can do it better.
Yeah.
And so the way I think talking about complexity is difficult. It's harder. It's not the easy road.
Okay, sorry.
But the easy road is not always the best one. And so the best way we can teach consent, especially in these secondary spaces where, you know, we're young adults, where we have these experiences, where we understand things from a more grown-up perspective, is to talk about the nuance in all of its messiness. Because to truly kind of understand these things, it helps to pick them apart and to talk about them directly, still, you know, using safe language, but as direct as we can be, because I'm here to
So give young people the credit they deserve to be able to have these complex conversations in the classroom and make sure it's safe and accessible, which I think leads us into my next question quite nicely. We've spoken. Oh, sorry. Before we do, Sharika, do you have something to add?
Yeah, it's kind of speaking to what Ron was saying about maturity, and we need to acknowledge like the maturity levels of the people we're teaching. So, you know, again with the oversimplification of, you know, videos like the tea video or the spaghetti video or the milkshake video, it oversimplifies sexual assault in itself and consent in itself, which then is harmful because, you know, when we're out talking about, you know, sexual assault, we have this image of sexual assault consent is like tea. So it's not actually that serious. The video was funny. The video made me laugh. So sexual assault is going to make me laugh. Sexual assault is funny. And obviously humor is an important tool, especially for the young people. It does help sort of break the tension. It does hold our attention a lot more as well. But we need to know when it's appropriate as well. And having all of these things like, you know, having everything be synonymous with each other, having, you know, harassment, rape, groping, stalking, all be synonymous, all being, you know, the same thing that we think about, like undervalues the actual like importance and the significance of these acts. And because we all think, we hear these words so much a lot of the time, and so the words have power, we all know this, and so having these words be reduced to sexual assault is like tea, sexual assault is like throwing spaghetti in someone's face, oversimplified and, you know, underrepresents how severe these things can actually be. Is what I wanted to say.
Thank you. I love it. I appreciate that. We've spoken quite a lot in our conversations around making sure that the consent conversation is as inclusive as possible and it is intersectional to its core. Rowan, could you please define intersectionality for us?
So intersectionality is something you can define in a lot of different ways. But fundamentally, where we come from in understanding intersectionality is that people's lived experiences accumulate and intersect. So someone's experience of life because of their gender will intersect with their experience of life because of their race, because of their ability level, because of their sexuality. These things are not independent states. Yeah, they don't exist in a vacuum. And so the idea of teaching something intersectionally is acknowledging and embracing that diversity and making sure we include all of those paradigms of lived experience.
Incredible, thank you. Love that definition. Vitaly, I'd love to hear from you about why taking an intersectional approach in the classroom is so important.
Yeah, well, I think one of the main takeaways from our conversations has been that creating a safe place in the consent education classroom is the best thing we can do.
Mm-hmm.
And the lack of diversity that I've had experience with in my consent education classrooms means that it's not safe for everyone. So consent looks different for everyone depending on, as Ron said, like sexuality or gender or neurodiversity or anything really. And it's, yeah, no student in the classroom deserves to be left out or only added as an afterthought to the conversation about consent. So I think it's really important that if the teacher doesn't feel comfortable doing it, getting people in, doing professional development, like learning along with the students in order to be able to support everyone in the classroom is really.
Thank you so much for speaking to that. I think it is a really important part of doing this work, making sure that it's best practice aligned, is making sure that all the young people in the room are included and represented and do feel safe in that space. We've spoken quite a lot about cultural safety and how consent looks different across different cultures. Would any of you like to speak to cultural safety in the classroom?
So I think as the cultural safety, our cultures are so different. We live in a multicultural society. And so in the classroom, it's not a monolith. Everyone comes from a different background, whether it be different countries or just simply different family dynamics. It's really important that we acknowledge that everyone's going to have different experiences and everyone's understanding and, lived experience with consent is going to be different, and we shouldn't sort of undervalue someone else's just because it's not the conventional way of how consent is viewed. And a lot of the times this does come with different cultural backgrounds. We know that generational trauma is a real big part of the reason why there are so many cultural differences in our society. And a lot of the times, a lot of people, personally, I know that, until, we moved to Australia, all my family has lived in big family houses with everyone in the same house, where privacy wasn't really a big focus because, well, there was no privacy and there was no need for privacy at the time. But then coming back to my generation in the way that, my house is, where there's only, there's only 4 people in the house. The need for privacy has now become a focus point. And a lot of the times it is difficult for people with different cultural backgrounds to understand and grasp consent because it's never been seen as the priority because, a lot of the times with different cultural backgrounds, a lot of their autonomy has been stripped due to things like colonization and slavery. And so consent isn't seen to be a big issue just because there were bigger issues. And so we need to be able to acknowledge the fact and teach consent differently to people who have had different experiences, but also make sure that they're included and make sure that they don't feel as though their experience with consent is less than or not right or wrong or they should change or their culture needs to, shift in order to fit these, Western standards.
Incredible. Thank you so much. Vitaly, you wanted to add something?
I just wanted to talk about as well acknowledging how heteronormative our consent education programs currently are. And it needs to, again, be inclusive of everyone and provide everyone's space and ability to ask questions or be taught about their own individual needs in a relationship. Because in my experience of like sex education and consent education, it was very much like guy and a girl. But yeah, I think it needs to change because that's not the society we live in. And especially at lots of like inner city schools, there's a lot of focus on like rainbow days or wet purple days, but it needs to be integrated into other parts of the curriculum rather than just put on the show at rainbow days.
You're gay, we'll let you wear the rainbows in June, but if you kiss your girlfriend, you can look at your girlfriend.
No, we do know that a lot of consent education does privilege the perspectives and experiences of straight cis people, but we know that it needs to be inclusive of and represent the experiences of queer young people, of trans, gender non-conforming young people. It needs to be embedded into the curriculum, not just consent education, the education system at large. But we're here today to talk about the consent education. So how can educators move away from this heteronormative approach?
I think firstly, not teaching LGBTQ plus consent and sex ed and not treating it as a joke. A lot of the times in my experience, it's been very much been like an afterthought, like, well, this is how, a man and a woman have sex, but gay people can have sex too, so it's very, it just feels like an afterthought. It doesn't represent the identities in the classroom, but also, it makes it seem as it's really unsafe and as well because we often talk in terms of gay sex education, the AIDS epidemic, and we know how because of the lack of resources, lack of education, how devastating that was, and how many lives lost, how many families were ruined, and obviously I don't mean to say that not teaching people about gay sex is going to cause the AIDS epidemic to happen again. I don't mean to say that. But why should only, straight people and heterosexual people learn about how to have safe sex? Why should that, courtesy not be given to everyone else? And it is a very ignorant idea and way of thinking to think that, well, most of the kids in the classroom are straight, so why do we need to teach it? I'm straight, so why do I need to know about gay sex, And then, but the reverse can be said, well, gay people are gay, why do they need to know about straights? So I think it's a very sort of hypocritical system we have where we're only teaching LGBTQ plus education as an afterthought, or we're using them as, props to make diversity look better, and we need to find a way to make sure that all voices are included, but they're not being used as a diversity token or, a way to show that, my school's diverse, we have gay people, we have black
Poster up on the wall.
So, yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Okay, so really integrating and embedding representation in the classroom. Incredible, Rowan.
Yeah, I was sort of coming on from what Trika said, in the sense that we do a disservice, I think, to students when we talk only about the majority, because we come from this sort of standpoint of what we need to do is, I had a really great learning support teacher who once told me that we teach to the bell curve. And I think that that's also true in the sense of what we do is we teach to the largest amount of people possible, because we think if we get the majority, then that's the best we can do, and the others will find ways to support them sort of in different ways, or outside the classroom or in different sort of spaces. But when we talk about what the majority looks like, you know, we can layer on these sort of ideas of what makes someone the majority, what makes someone privileged, you know, cis, white, straight, male, you know, non-disabled, neurotypical. And if we layer all that on top, we actually get a small minority of people, right? So I think what we need to understand is sort of this intersectional approach in that a lot of people are part of minority groups. If you put them all together, they probably eclipse the number of people who aren't. There are people who are multiply marginalized, you know, like us. And so when we take these sort of diverse viewpoints out of our broader education, we're actually not teaching the majority. We're teaching the minority. And so at my school, we have a respectful relationships day. It's a single day. And you know, I don't need to be online necessarily. My school's consent curriculum, because compared to some others, it's pretty good. But we did a respectful relationships. I go to a little girls' school. I'm not a girl, but we do it with an all-boys school. Because there's this sort of idea that these relationships will be between men and women, and so we need to introduce them to each other. And the problem is that a lot of the time, and this is, I didn't attend that day for reasons, but I have friends who did, and the feedback I got a lot from them was they were having to teach the boys, right, about behavior that wasn't okay. You know, they were having to try to dismantle stereotypes and talk to people about, you know, maybe you shouldn't do that, maybe you shouldn't say that. And so they got a lot less out of it than the boys did because they were being used as a teaching tool. And I don't necessarily think that was the intention, but that sort of ended up being the way it turned out. And after that day, we had sort of a debrief with people from Body Safety Australia. And Deanne came in to talk to us.
Our incredible CEO.
Yeah, not name dropping or anything, but like about that. And one of the things that she said that I thought was really important that sort of stuck in my brain was that a lot of these conversations about consent started in queer communities. They started in queer and teen communities, and yet these people are still being locked out of the mainstream conversation that sort of, in a sense, came from them. And so I think what we can learn from that is that we have a lot to teach each other. Yeah. You know, straight people can learn from what consent looks like in a queer space just as much as neurotypical people can learn from what consent looks like in a neurodivergent space, because these are all different insights that can inform how we understand our own experience, how we understand power, how we understand privilege, things like being coerced or pressured or being compliant. That these things are all, I should probably define this term, shouldn't I?
Yes. Go for it.
So when we talk about coercion, what we mean is sort of the obvious kind of pressure. When someone says, if you don't do this, I'll do this. You know, it's blackmail, it's threats, it's something that, aside from actual physical force, is the easiest to point to say this is violence. And so we talk about it more because it's more obvious, it's an easier example. And then pressure is sort of more of a grey area in the sense that it's still external, but it's less explicit. You end up with more sort of, oh, you know, well, everyone else is doing it. Like, you don't have to do it, but like, we're all doing it. So, you know, maybe if I don't do it, I'm going to be cool, stuff like that. And then compliance it's a whole different beast. It's a much more difficult, complex topic because it's not something you can see. But compliance is when you're not even consciously aware of pressure. You behave in a way that you think is consistent with what the people on top of the power dynamics want. Like in a classroom, you know, I said this in one of our discussions, right? In a classroom, there will be people who will, when the teacher says sit down, there will be people who will sit down because the teacher has to outright say, if you don't sit down, I'll give you detention. That's coercion. Obviously, I'm not saying it's a bad thing, but
we do it all the time.
Yeah, all the time, right? And there are people who sit down because everyone else is sitting down, and so if I don't sit down, I'll look weird. And there are people who sit down just because they just intuitively understand that the teacher's in charge, and so they do what they say. And so compliance looks a lot more like that subtler pressure that comes from sort of behaving in a power gradient, which power imbalances exist in every aspect of society for lots of different reasons, and they're not necessarily bad or evil, and compliance isn't necessarily bad or evil. But when we talk about it in a consent space, it's something we have to be conscious and aware of, because we don't always realize that we're complying.
Yeah, we spoke recently about how everybody complies and faces pressure and coercion in lots of different situations all the time, every day. But when it comes to consent and boundaries being pushed, that's a different conversation.
And it's something we have to be much more conscious and aware of.
Yeah, in the consent conversation, we need to factor in power imbalances and how that contributes towards people's experience with coercion, pressure, and compliance.
So I think when we're talking about power imbalances, we have this sort of saying. I'm sure everyone here knows it. It's the boys will be boys saying, and we've all seen sort of excuses be made for young men, young boys when they're doing something that isn't appropriate, but their behaviour there's no consequences. They're still being encouraged, and that is giving them power. That is giving them the power to know that no matter what they do, their consequences will be minimal or they won't exist, because they are boys. Boys will be boys. And then also we've seen, there's this, stereotype of this loud, obnoxious, disruptive boy in a classroom being sat next to the quiet, good girl, because she will fix his behaviour.
That happened to me with someone who was bullying me. And I was forced to sit next to them for an extended period of time so they would learn from me.
Yeah.
And instead, I got depressed.
And so again, like, we're again giving them that power. And so if we want to talk about dismantling power structures and dismantling like power imbalances, we always think of the bigger picture of, like, how are we supposed to dismantle this patriarchal system that we've lived in for however many centuries. But it often isn't. We don't often need to be thinking about that. It can be so simple to do it within the classroom every day, as soon as you get a new group of students. And it's these little things that we say, and, we have to be very mindful of our language. Just because our words have power, and without knowing it intentionally, you could be, giving some boy a power trip because he thinks that, he can talk to his female teacher however he wants, because, he's a boy and she's just a girl, And so authority figures are important in that conversation, and in that respect, you guys have the most power, and that's not a negative power imbalance, I'd say. On the whole, it is a positive, power imbalance that is needed in that situation. But, we need to be aware that these power imbalances are created by us a lot of the time, and follow through into adulthood and beyond, and get passed down again, until we're left with something, we can't really solve now.
Interesting. I would love to ask, how do you feel some people are impacted more by these power imbalances than others? When we're talking about adopting an intersectional approach, how can we do that in the classroom and consider power imbalance safely?
I think that age is definitely a big thing, because we are all often taught from very young ages that, you respect people who are older than you.
Yeah.
So if there is a relationship where there's a significant age difference, I feel like that power imbalance definitely goes to the older person.
Okay, I can give them a call.
Yeah, and people who are in positions of authority. I think,
We've spoken a lot about this, the age dynamic and how that influences power. Do you want to speak more to how age contributes towards power and consent?
Yeah, there's But we're aware, and that's the reason we have specific laws about age of consent, that age is a really big factor in maturity and understanding. And so someone who's older can take advantage of that power imbalance, not only to to do something bad, but also that it may be that the victim doesn't even know that that's not how things are supposed to be, because they don't have the experience. Like, I think it was Matali who mentioned it before we were talking about grooming, that sometimes it's not, the person who's being groomed doesn't realize until afterwards that what happened to them wasn't normal and it wasn't okay, because that power imbalances can be exploited, can be exercised in a way that's so subtle that the person who's a victim of that conduct doesn't even realize there's an imbalance. And the other thing I think I was going to say was, we've talked a lot, obviously, about how we have that sort of boys will be boys thing, and how a lot of the time we empower young AMAB people and young men who behave badly, and we don't give them appropriate consequences when they do. But there's sort of the flip side to that when it comes to this sort of messy consent discussion, which is that boys are victims of sexual assault too. That while we understand statistically the majority of perpetrators are male, the majority of victims are female, and we can't look away from that reality because it's important. But if we only talk about that and we only have this understanding of sexual assault as something that is done by boys to girls, then we lose sight of the fact that girls can be perpetrators and boys can be victims. And there's a even bigger stigma for young men who've been victims of sexual assault because, as Shrika was saying, right? There's this idea that you need to be strong and you need to, if it happened to you, it's your fault for being weak. And, it comes back to, right, how we need to have these broader conversations, these intersectional conversations, talking about lots of different people's lived experiences, because if we don't empower those young men to speak out about what happened to them, then they will be hurt. And so intersectionality is important to make people heard, to make people safe, and to help people learn. And so in the classroom, we should always be aware that there are many different people in the classroom. Even in a single-sex school, not everyone there's going to be a girl. I'm living proof of that, right? But, power imbalances don't just happen with age and with authority. They can also happen with things like disability, for instance. As a neurodiverse person, I don't always have the best social grasp of situations. And neurotypical people have exploited that in the past to push my boundaries because I didn't understand that what was happening wasn't cool. And so these power imbalances can show up in all kinds of different ways, and that's why intersectionality is important, and that's why understanding experiences of consent through a diverse lens is important, because it looks different for everyone.
I think we've really emphasized the need for the classroom to be intersectional. I'm curious, how can we put that into practice? What can teachers do?
So one of the things, I guess, is to bring in people who are, of multiple identities, whether it be, person of color, queer person, a neurodivergent person, disabled person, whoever it may be, who can speak to an experience that not everyone has, and to also represent a community that is often underrepresented. Also, we mentioned before PD days. That is something that schools can look more into to make sure that, they're actually learning how, if it isn't possible due to lack of resources, lack of availability, whatever it may be, that it isn't possible to bring someone else in, that, they are equipped with the knowledge and the tools to be able to teach that knowledge in an acceptable way that isn't speaking over minority voices, but is speaking to minorities in the room. Yeah.
I think also inclusive language is really important. And we have a lot of, especially, oh my god, my voice is absolutely a disaster today.
It's more.
No, I'm all right. Then in the consent space, we talk a lot about gender, and when we talk about gender, we talk about men and women, or male and female. And when sometimes we use that language that, you know, excludes trans people, very often excludes non-binary people, you know, and, you know, excludes queer people when we talk about, oh, you know, sex is between a man and a woman, blah, 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 or maybe there's gay people involved, who knows. And when we have, you know, PSAs that come from sort of a very white Western standpoint that have, you know, not very diverse casts in any respect, you know, that we need to decolonize the consent room.
Decolonize it.
Decolonize everything, but also sex and classroom. Yeah. And just simply, you know, it doesn't have to be perfect, right? We understand that our teachers aren't perfect. You know, I get misgendered by teachers all the time. But that, I remember less of the 5 times a teacher misgendered me and more than one time they got it right, because it shows me they're trying. And that's what really matters to me. That's what we notice as young people. We see when teachers are trying and doing their best. So, you know, you, the educators who are listening, right? Don't be afraid to screw up, because you will. You're human, right? But if you screw up, what we all notice is that you tried, and that's better than not trying.
That's all we can ask
That's all we can ask for, and that's what we want. You know, we want you to try, and if anything, we want you to screw up, and then acknowledge the screw up, and, you know, be honest
and be better
and open about it, and be better next time, because that is good.
Yeah. Have these earnest and real raw conversations with young people, because clearly they're capable of having these conversations and wanting to be brought in. Shrita?
So this is kind of tied back more to consent and specifically assault. So in the school community, it is when someone comes forward with their story, with their situation, listen.
Oh, yeah.
First, listen, then figure out all the details, whether it happened, what happened, where it happened, why it happened. Because if someone is coming forth, that is one of the bravest things that they can do. That is an incredibly hard thing. They know that they probably won't be believed. They know probably nothing will happen. Consequences won't be handed out. But they come forth and they've told their story and they've acknowledged the fact that they've been wronged, and they want to make the steps to fix it. And again, listen and treat it as an individual situation. So we all spoke about sort of biases that we have. So we, again, have this idea of perfect victim, perfect perpetrator. It's really hard to sort of conceptualize the fact that, you know, a teenager who is coming to you and saying that they've been assaulted on the soccer pitch, you know, because that is right at school, that is where you are, and it is often hard to realize that, you know, that is something that does happen. So treating every story as its own individual story, not bringing in past biases, what you know about assault, what assault actually looks like. Because if someone feels as though their physical, sexual boundaries have been violated, that is assault.
Yeah.
Whether or not it was intentional or unintentional can be discussed later, but that is assault.
Mm-hmm.
And so acknowledging that and realizing that, you know, whether you think it is assault or not, it was assault to the person who believes it was assault. And then also actually speaking to the perpetrators and understanding why this happened, not just from the victim's perspective as well, because a lot of the times, again, Rowan said, it could just be simple miscommunication. They thought that they were able to do this, but they weren't, you know. And so actually having those discussions, making sure it's not an environment where, you know, the victim has to actually sit in front of the perpetrator and be like, no, you did this, and but actually, you know, understanding and talking to them and making sure that they realize that what they've done is wrong, whether they meant to or not, because accidents happen. And not every sexual assault is an accident, but there are cases where that happens. And realizing that, you know, what you can do in that situation is give them the knowledge that empowers them to realize that in the future, okay, I'm not going to do this because it hurt someone, and I'm not allowed to do that unless I ask. Or so giving them that knowledge so that they know that, you know, sexual assault isn't just in an alleyway, isn't just, you know, when you're older. isn't just from some person you don't know, so that they're more empowered to feel as though they've been informed about their wrongdoing, they can improve themselves in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. We know that in order to have a positive result from a disclosure, the young person needs to be believed and they need to be supported and action needs to be taken. And having the approach that we take to disclosures informed by the lived experiences of young people is incredibly important. So thank you so much for vulnerably sharing in this moment how educators can do that work. I really appreciate it. And I'm sure the educators listening have a lot to take from that. Rowan, would you like to speak more to that?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, what Shrink says is important in that it doesn't matter what the intention was, what matters is the harm caused.
Yeah.
And if someone has been harmed by an action, it doesn't really matter what the intent was or what the behavior was. What matters is the harm that was caused. And so that person needs to be supported, they need to be believed, they need to be protected, even if it isn't something you think looks like real sexual assault. But, you know, we have a vision, right, for what the future of consent education can look like.
Tell us, what is it?
So, what I think is really important is this isn't a one-off thing, right? You got to start young, and you got to start you know, that ideally consent education should start in early learning, should start in kindergarten. But again, like I said earlier, not talking about consent solely in the sexual realm. We talk about it with younger kids in a way that's age appropriate, in a way they can understand, and more importantly, have teachers model it. Because it's one thing for a teacher to say, you shouldn't touch someone's hair unless they say you can. And another for a teacher to actually ask a kid, is it okay if I touch your hair? Because we model our behavior on the adults who care for us. And so the best thing an educator can do to teach a kid, especially a young kid, is to do it by example. And that we can scaffold that education up into secondary spaces where we do start to expand our understanding of consent to sex and to romantic relationships when students are mature and ready enough to have those conversations, and as well have experts involved. You know, we talked a lot about how the best thing sometimes that you can do is to understand when you need to ask for. And so if teachers can be taught really well to know what they're doing and to have those discussions in the classroom, because, you know, Shrika was saying, right, did you want to tell them what you think about, like, how teachers should
With professional development?
Yeah. Oh, yeah, sorry.
have a better relationship?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, you know, it's one of the easiest ways to create a good relationship with your students is to share details about how you're learning. And so coming back from those personal development, you know, and telling your students, this is what I learned, this is why I went, this is why I was chosen, this is what I've gained, is so helpful as well, because then they'll also gain something themselves. Knowledge is passed on. And, you know, we always talk about the forgetting curve as well. And so we always, as educators, I'm sure you all know about the forgetting curve. And so we forget, you know, 75% of the information after the first time we learn it. And so it applies to consent education too. Like, if we're starting at a young age, reinforcing this information throughout the year, as the years go on, building upon it, then students are going to have a more solid and well-rounded understanding of consent education and education about boundaries. And I think that one of the biggest issues when it comes to consent education is the fact that we aren't taught how to set boundaries properly and how to set them in a way that is, like, appropriate in sort of the language we use, because I often hear this very formal way of setting boundaries as the way you should set boundaries, you know, sitting someone down and saying, you know, being very formal about it, but honestly, that's not the way we talk, that's not the way younger people talk. And so figuring out a way that we can teach how to set good boundaries, not to do with sex, at the start, obviously, but to do with friendships. Like, I'm sure most of us have had an experience with friends where, you know, we felt as though our boundaries weren't respected, but we weren't able to articulate it because we didn't know why we were feeling as though we were being violated because, you know, we weren't being assaulted. We were just not having our boundaries be respected. So teaching that at a young age is really crucial, I think.
Yeah, teaching young people to be able to like tune in and recognize when something doesn't feel right and having the skills to communicate that. And then on the flip side, also making sure that people can recognize when somebody's boundaries have been crossed and how they can make sure that they're not crossing those boundaries.
I think the biggest thing, and if there's one thing we want you to take away from this, it's agency, which is that young people are people. Sound. And that in secondary education, you know, my school at least talks a lot about agency and learning and taking responsibility for your own learning and stuff like that. And so I think consent education should really come from a standpoint of agency, even for younger kids to understand that they have agency and that that agency should be respected. If they set boundaries, people shouldn't violate them, and that they can set boundaries. And as you get older, you build on that knowledge, and you also understand better your agency in the space on how you can set boundaries and respect other people's boundaries, and how you can interact, you know, positively in a consent classroom, which sometimes means you have to be loud, because we've talked a lot about making the classroom safe for victims and for people with adverse experiences, but sometimes you can't be safe in these spaces, and people should be able to, if they feel like they need to, should be able to withdraw from these discussions. My school has a process for that, but you have to talk to someone. You can't just not show up, right? And I understand the sort of instinct that, oh, kids are just going to starve, right? But in these spaces, it can be really harmful to force disclosure. And a lot of the time, if you say, I don't think I can be here, you get asked why. And you have to sort of prove that your distress or your trauma is valid in order to not be in that space. So again, it comes back to respecting agency, right? Letting people make their own decisions about what is and isn't safe for them and what they can and can't do. And yeah, just, you know, agency, intersectionality, both from a diversity standpoint and from a professional standpoint, you know, having experts and teachers work together, the best of both worlds.
Absolutely.
And complexity.
Yeah. Absolutely true.
So again, with what Ron was saying, obviously there are people who just aren't comfortable in that environment just because they've had experience or for whatever reason. And so, but it is also important that all students are able to get the fundamental knowledge at least.
Yeah.
So, you know, there are ways to sort of work around that where if someone maybe say isn't as comfortable with sitting in when they're talking about sex specifically or, you know, sexual assault specifically, we can break up that knowledge and we can sort of, you know, have breaks in between where when we're teaching this first conversation that is going to be about specifically just boundaries in general, what is a boundary, how do we set boundaries, what is consent, and then maybe sort of going on into, you know, this is how it works in relation to sex, in relation to friendships, in relation to whatever, just so that people, you know, again, have the agency to leave when they need to, and have forewarning and leave when they need to, but also so that they know that, you know, they've at least got this fundamental knowledge and they know that, you know, their experiences in the future, they have tools that they can use to help themselves and to heal and to, you know, I guess, you know, be better people in that way.
Incredible. Do any of you have any other insights you would like to add around recommendations for any educators listening in how they can make sure that this practice is as intersectional and safe as possible? Sum it up.
As they listen to professionals and just do your best. Do your best.
Incredible. Thank you so much to the incredible panelists who have shared some honestly incredible insights into how we as adults can do better work in this field. I think that it is our job as adults, as educators, as parents and as carers to ensure that we are creating communities of young people who are empowered themselves, who have agency to build safe and healthy relationships, moving away from this idea of harm reduction and towards empowering and taking a strength-based approach. So it's our job to continue listening to young people, hearing directly from them and informing our practice from the insights that they share. So I hope you've taken as much as I have away from the incredible insight that they've shared and can continue doing this learning. It doesn't just stop here today. I hope you continue to do this work, to decolonize your practice, to clear your practice, to trans your practice, to make sure that it is to its core intersectional, considering all of the diverse needs of the young people in your classroom and the future young people that I know you'll work with and I'm sure have incredible positive impact on. Thank you so much for being here today and choosing to show up to listen to the experiences of young people. It is so powerful when we do that, and I'm really grateful. So thank you so much, including to the panellists, but also to Body Safety Australia at large for holding this space, holding this conversation, and to Safe and Equal for funding today and making sure today can happen. I'll leave you to the rest of your day. Thank you so much. This event will be posted live, so it'll be on our website. You can share it with your colleagues, you can share it with your peers and parents and educators, carers who are keen to continue doing this work as well. It's about upskilling ourselves, but also upskilling communities. So go and share our content, share this conversation around, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you all.